The moment Phineas Lawson was handed a sealed letter and a woman's travel trunk, he knew his life was about to become considerably more complicated than it had been the day before. He had been nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee at Danner's General Store in the dusty town of Caldwell, Kansas, when Sheriff Orrin Prout pushed through the door with that particular look on his face. The look that meant someone was about to be volunteered for something they hadn't asked for. It was the spring of 1874, and the plain stretched on in every direction like a vast, indifferent canvas, golden and windswept, smelling of sage and turned earth. "Lawson," the sheriff said, settling into the chair across from him with deliberate slowness, the kind that told Phineas the man was about to ask a favor large enough to require sitting down. "You're heading out toward Fort Larned in the next few days, aren't you?" Phineas set down his cup. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked outdoors their entire lives, with dark brown hair that curled at the collar and gray eyes that had a habit of squinting, even when the sun wasn't particularly bright, as though he were always measuring something from a distance. He had a jaw that needed a razor more often than it got one, and hands that were calloused and capable and presently wrapped around a ceramic mug like it might be the last peaceful thing he'd hold for some time. "I was thinking about it," he said carefully. "Good, then this'll work out nicely." Sheriff Prout produced the letter and slid it across the table. "Got a situation. Woman came in on the stage last night. Name's Alice Leland. She's from St. Louis. Her father made arrangements with a Colonel Hartfield out at Fort Larned. She was supposed to marry one of the officers stationed there, a lieutenant named Coverley, the man her father selected." Phineas looked at the letter but didn't pick it up. And the fellow who was supposed to ride out with her took sick, bad sick. He won't be traveling for weeks, and Miss Leland's got a window here. Colonel Hartfield's expecting her by the 15th, and that's 12 days from now. Coverley's being reassigned at the end of the month. She needs to reach the fort before then or the whole arrangement falls apart. The sheriff leaned back. "I need someone capable and decent to escort her. Someone who knows the trail. You've got deputies." "I've got one deputy with a broken collarbone and another who's got a wife about to give birth any day." "You know that trail better than anyone in this county, Phineas. You've ridden it 6 times in the last 2 years. Phineas picked up the letter now. It was sealed with wax and addressed to Colonel Hartfield. Beside it, the sheriff placed a second, shorter note instructions written in a neat, firm hand that must have belonged to a father who was very sure of himself and very far away. "She's waiting over at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house," the sheriff said. "She's agreeable to the arrangement, apparently. Well-mannered. Her father sent word by telegraph this morning asking me to arrange proper escort since the original plan fell through." "I'm no chaperone," Phineas said. "No, but you're the best rider and the most trustworthy man I know in this county who isn't otherwise occupied." The sheriff folded his hands. "I'll pay you $20 for the trip, standard escort fee. You deliver her safely to Fort Larned, hand her off to Colonel Hartfield, and come back. Simple." It was not, as it turned out, simple. Phineas agreed because $20 was a decent sum, and because he had been planning to ride out toward Fort Larned anyway to check on a land parcel he'd been considering. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was nothing but a business arrangement. He went to collect his horse from the livery, checked his saddlebags, added some extra provisions, and then walked to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house with his hat in his hands and a sense of mild reluctance he couldn't quite put his finger on. Mrs. Calloway answered the door, examined him from boots to collar, and apparently decided he was acceptable because she stood aside and called up the stairs. Alice Leland came down those stairs with the particular careful grace of a woman who had learned to navigate narrow staircases in wide skirts, and was not about to let a new environment disrupt that habit. She was 22 years old, which he registered because the sheriff had told him so, and because it mattered for practical purposes of knowing who he was dealing with. She was not what he'd expected, though he would have struggled to say what he had expected. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a traveling style that had, he could see, spent a night in a boarding house and a bumpy stage ride, and was still managing to look reasonably composed. Her eyes were a clear, steady hazel, neither green nor brown, but something that changed depending on what the light was doing, and she had a way of looking at a person directly that was unusual enough to register. She was carrying a small leather traveling bag and wearing a practical navy dress, rather than the enormous hoop-skirted confection he might have expected from a St. Louis woman, and that, he admitted to himself privately, was a point in her favor. "Mr. Lawson," she said, and extended her hand in the way a woman does when she is deciding whether to trust someone and is using the handshake as part of that assessment. "Miss Leland," he said, and shook it. Her grip was firm. "The sheriff tells me you know the route well. 6 times, he said, and you'll have us there by the 12th. If the weather holds and we don't hit trouble, yes." She studied him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being measured the same way he measured distances. Then she nodded, as though some interior calculation had resolved itself in his favor, and turned to Mrs. Calloway to thank her for the hospitality. They left Caldwell on a Tuesday morning, with a packed mule named Chester, 2 horses, his bay gelding, Amos, and a rented sorrel mare for Alice, and enough provisions for 12 days on the trail with some margin for error. The sky was a wide, cloudless blue, and the prairie wind had that particular soft quality it sometimes had in late spring, before the heat settled in and turned it into something that stripped moisture from everything it touched. He had done this kind of thing before. Guided travelers, escorted supply lines, ridden alongside strangers who needed someone to know the way. He was good at it. He knew how to be professionally friendly and professionally distant at the same time, how to answer questions about the trail without inviting questions about himself, how to be a presence rather than a person. Alice Leland, he discovered in the first 3 hours, was not particularly interested in letting him maintain that professional distance. "You've lived in Caldwell long?" she asked, as they cleared the last of the town's outbuildings and settled into the steady pace that would carry them through the first day. "About 4 years. Where before that?" "Texas, mostly. Before that, Missouri." "I'm from Missouri," she said, and there was something in her voice not quite surprise, more like the small satisfaction of finding an unexpected point of connection. "St. Louis, like the sheriff said. Have you been there? Passed through?" She was quiet for a moment, and he thought the conversation might settle into something more navigable. Then, "What do you do besides escort people across the prairie?" He glanced over at her. She was riding the sorrel mare with easy confidence, better than he'd expected, actually. She had a straight back and relaxed hands on the reins, and she wasn't fighting the horse the way nervous riders did. "Little of everything," he said. "I have a quarter section I farm in a limited way. Some cattle. I do freighting work in the off-season. Do you like it?" The question was so simple and so direct that he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. "The freighting, any of it, your life out here?" He thought about that more seriously than the question probably warranted. The plains spread around them in every direction, enormous and beautiful in the morning light, the grass moving in long, slow waves like the surface of a shallow sea. A hawk was circling high overhead, patient and absolute. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." She looked at the landscape around them with those clear, changing eyes, and he saw something pass across her face, not wistfulness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that registered and then was carefully put away. "That's a good thing," she said quietly, "to like where you are." They made good time the first day, covering nearly 20 miles before the light began to soften, and he started looking for a suitable place to camp. He found one near a cluster of cottonwood trees beside a shallow creek, where the horses could water, and there was enough wood for a fire. He set up the camp with practiced efficiency while Alice proved, again, unexpectedly useful. She unsaddled her own mare without being asked, hobbled her competently, and then set to gathering firewood without any discussion. "You've camped before," he said, unable to keep the surprise entirely out of his voice. She looked up from the armful of dry branches she was carrying. My uncle had a farm in Illinois. We spent summers there. He wasn't the type to let children sit inside. A small smile. I'm not entirely helpless, Mr. Lawson, despite what my travel trunk might suggest. He made coffee over the fire, and she accepted the tin cup with both hands and sat on the ground rather than on the folding stool he'd set out for her, which he found he respected. The fire crackled between them, and the prairie night settled in with its wide, profound silence broken only by the occasional distant cry of a coyote and the steady sound of the horses pulling at the grass. "Tell me about Fort Larned," she said. He looked at her across the fire. The light moved on her face in a way that made the auburn in her hair seem almost orange. "What do you want to know? What it's like? I've never been to a military installation." She paused. "I've never been west of Kansas City, actually. This is already further west than I've been." "Fort Larned's a proper fort," he said. "Stone buildings, most of it now. They've been rebuilding. It's on the Pawnee Fork of the Arkansas River. About 500 soldiers stationed there last I knew. Some families. Officers' wives. It's a real community. And Colonel Hartfield, I've met him twice. He's a serious man, fair from what I've seen, runs a tight post." She nodded slowly, turning the tin cup in her hands. "And the lieutenant, Coverley." She said the name with a particular flatness, like she was practicing the weight of it. He studied her face carefully. "You've not met him?" "No." She looked into the fire. "It was arranged through correspondence. My father and Colonel Hartfield are old friends." The colonel put forward the lieutenant's name as an appropriate match. There were letters exchanged. Mine were polite, a small pause. His were very formal. Phineas was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to," he started and then stopped himself, because it wasn't his business and it wasn't his place. She looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "No, please, whatever you were going to say." He turned his own cup in his hands. "You don't have to go through with it if it isn't what you want, that's all." The fire popped. A log shifted. She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed through her expression that he couldn't entirely read. Gratitude, maybe, or something more complicated than that. "My father is a very determined man," she said finally, "and I have always been a dutiful daughter." He didn't say anything else about it that night, and she didn't bring it up again, and they settled into the comfortable quiet of two people who have said enough for one evening and are content to let the fire do the rest of the talking. He lay awake for longer than he should have, watching the stars arrange themselves in their ancient patterns above the Kansas plains, and thought about the word dutiful, and the way she'd said it, and the weight it seemed to carry. The second day was harder. The wind picked up from the southwest and brought with it a warm, gritty dust that made the horses skittish and the riding uncomfortable, and they had to stop twice to water the animals and let them rest. Alice rode without complaint through all of it, a bandana pulled up over her nose and mouth, her hat brim pulled down, managing the sorrel mare with steady, patient hands. During a rest stop in the middle of the afternoon, while they were sheltering in the lee of a dry wash while a particularly aggressive gust passed, she asked him how he had learned to read the weather out here. "Mostly by being wrong about it enough times that I started paying better attention," he said honestly. She laughed, genuinely laughed, not the polite little sounds he'd been half expecting from a city-raised woman, and the laugh was warm and unguarded, and it did something to the space between his ribs that he didn't immediately have a name for. "My father used to say that the best teacher is a mistake made in a place where you can still recover from it," she said. "Your father sounds sensible." "He is, in most respects." She was quiet for a moment. "He loves me very much. I don't want you to think he arranged this out of unkindness. He genuinely believes he is securing my future." "I don't doubt it," Phineas said, and he didn't. He had seen enough of the world to understand that people could do hurtful things from entirely loving motives, and that this did not make the hurt less real, but did make the people more comprehensible. She looked at him sideways. "You're more thoughtful than I expected from a." She stopped, with the slightly embarrassed expression of someone who has realized they are about to say something rude. "From a drifting cowboy," he offered, without any particular heat. I was going to say, from someone who lives this way, I didn't mean it as an insult. She genuinely looked mortified. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. It wasn't wrong, he said. Not inaccurate anyway. They looked at each other, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that was different from the first one on Mrs. Calloway's steps, less formal, warmer, like two people who have begun to see each other rather than simply look. The wind dropped enough to continue, and they rode on through the afternoon, and the conversation that day covered a remarkable amount of territory: her life in St. Louis, his years in Texas, books they had read and music they had heard, and their separate, different opinions about what the country was becoming. She had strong opinions and expressed them without apology, and he found himself responding with more genuine engagement than he usually permitted himself in conversations that weren't about horses or weather or trail conditions. It was on the morning of the third day that they reached the first river crossing. The Cimarron cutoff carried a crossing point he had used many times, where the river was wide and shallow in dry seasons, and considerably less cooperative when the spring melt had been heavy. He could see from 100 yards away that the river was running high, not flood stage dangerous, but higher than the easy knee-deep ford he'd used in September. The current had a muscular quality to it, pushing fast over a rocky bottom, and the water was brown with sediment from upstream rain. He pulled Amos to a stop on the bank and studied the crossing for a long minute. The horses could manage it, he was fairly sure of that, and the mule was steady. The question was Alice. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the river with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not fear, her expression was too thoughtful for pure fear. Something more complicated. She was calculating it, the same way she calculated everything, those hazel eyes working across the surface of the water, taking in the current, the depth, the far bank. It's higher than you expected, she said. It wasn't a question. We had rain upstream last week, I think. He looked at her steadily. I can get us across safely. The horses can manage it, and Chester's done worse. But I want you to tell me honestly, how comfortable are you in the water? She was quiet for a moment. I swim, she said carefully. Enough. The crossing worries me less than the current. Another pause, or perhaps I'm lying to myself. I'm not sure. He appreciated the honesty. He studied the river again, then looked back at her face, and something happened that he had not anticipated and could not have adequately explained afterward. Standing there on the bank of a running river in the Kansas spring, looking at this woman who had been in his company for 3 days and who was being delivered to another man, something in Phineas Lawson's chest went very quiet and very clear at the same time, like the moment after a storm when the air settles and you can suddenly see for miles. She was not supposed to be his delivery to make. She was not a package or a contract or a duty. She was a person, a particular, irreplaceable person, and the thought of handing her over to a formal lieutenant in a stone fort on the prairie, of watching her walk through those gates to fulfill her father's plans and her own dutiful compliance, was suddenly and completely unacceptable to him. He did not say any of this. He sat on his horse on the riverbank and understood that he had lost his nerve, not about the crossing, which he was perfectly capable of managing, but about everything that came after it, about continuing forward on this road to the ending that had been planned before he ever sat down across from Sheriff Prout in Danner's General Store. He could not cross this river and deliver Alice Leland to Fort Larned to marry a man she had never met. But he also understood, with the same clarity, that he had no right to say so. Not yet. Not without knowing considerably more about what she wanted and who she was, and whether what he was feeling was real, or just the peculiar intimacy of trail life that made everything feel more significant than it was. So he crossed the river. He went in first with Amos, testing the bottom, reading the current, finding the line. Then he came back for Chester, the mule, and led him across. Then he returned to the bank where Alice waited on the sorrel mare, and he talked her through it step by step, where to aim, how to hold her reins, how to lean slightly forward and let the mare pick her own footing. Keep your eyes on the far bank, he said. Don't look at the water. She nodded once, set her jaw, and rode that sorrel mare into the Cimarron with a steadiness that he found, in that moment, profoundly moving. The current pushed at them both as they crossed, the horses lunging through the deeper middle section, spray flying, the brown water swirling around their stirrups and then their knees, and Alice never flinched. She kept her eyes on the far bank and her hands steady, and she came out the other side with her dress wet to the thigh and her hat still on her head, and her expression that of someone who has done something difficult and is choosing to be satisfied about it. "Well," she said, when her mare climbed the far bank and shook herself. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him, and there was something in that look, a shared accomplishment, a moment of mutual recognition, that neither of them commented on but that neither of them forgot. They rode on through the morning, drying gradually in the wind, and he was aware with every mile of the feeling that had settled in him at the river crossing, quiet and immovable as a stone. He was going to have to do something about it. He was just not sure what, or when, or whether the something he did would make any difference at all. He found out more about her over the following days than he had any right to know about a woman he was supposed to deliver and leave. He found out that she had wanted to be a school teacher, and had, in fact, taught for 1 year in a schoolroom in St. Louis before her father had decided it wasn't suitable. He found out that she could ride better than most men he knew because her uncle's farm in Illinois had been a horse farm, and she'd grown up on horseback. He found out that she had read more widely than almost anyone he'd met, including the doctor in Caldwell who fancied himself intellectual, and that she had opinions about everything from agricultural policy to the question of whether the railroad companies were destroying or building the West. He found out that she was funny, in a quiet, dry way that surfaced at unexpected moments and always caught him slightly off guard and made him laugh before he knew he was going to. He found out that she could cook over a campfire better than he could, which she proved on the 4th night by taking over the preparation of supper without asking permission and producing something with dried beans and salt pork and a handful of wild onions she'd spotted near the creek that was materially better than anything he'd made over the previous 3 nights. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, eating with the appreciation of a man who has been making do with adequate food and has just encountered excellent food. "My mother," she said. "She died when I was 15. Before that, she taught me everything she thought I'd need." A pause, soft and not quite sad, more settled, the grief of something long carried. "She grew up on a homestead in Indiana. She always said the most important thing a woman could know was how to feed people well with whatever was available." "She was right," he said. Alice smiled at that, and the smile was the kind that involved more than just her mouth, the kind that reached her eyes and changed them, made the hazel shift warmer. "She usually was," she said. He thought about her mother that night, a woman who had grown up practical and taught her daughter to be practical, and had not lived long enough to see what use that practicality would be put to. He thought about the particular loneliness of a girl who had lost her mother at 15 and been left with a well-meaning but determined father who loved her and did not always understand her. He thought about duty and about desire, and about the space between them where most of a life gets lived. On the 5th day, they passed through a small settlement of homesteaders near the Pawnee Fork, a loose collection of sod houses and timber-framed barns that was trying very hard to be a town, and was perhaps 1 or 2 good years away from managing it. The people there were welcoming in the way of people who see few travelers and value the news they bring. They were invited to water their horses at the community well, and a woman named Hattie Bruns, who had a smile like sunlight and flour on her apron, pressed them both to come in for coffee and corn bread. They sat in the Bruns family's front room, which was also the kitchen, which was also most of the house, and drank real coffee from real ceramic cups, and Hattie Bruns asked the natural question, were they married? Phineas opened his mouth to say no, and Alice said, clearly and without hesitation, "Not yet." He stared at her. She looked at Hattie Bruns with a perfectly composed expression. Hattie Bruns beamed. "Oh, how lovely! Where are you headed?" "Fort Larned," Alice said. "Well, isn't that romantic, traveling together across the prairie?" Hattie patted Alice's hand. "My Herbert and I came out from Ohio on horseback, just the two of us. There's something about crossing this country together that either pulls two people apart or welds them together like iron." Phineas looked at the corn bread on his plate and said nothing, which was the most dignified option available to him. When they left the Bruns homestead and rode on across the afternoon prairie, he waited until they were a good half-mile out before he said, with studied calm, "Not yet." Alice kept her eyes forward. "It simplified matters. If I had said no, we weren't married, she would have been very concerned about the propriety of the situation, and we would have spent another 20 minutes reassuring her, and I didn't want the corn bread to get cold." "That's very logical," he said. "I thought so." "Not yet is a different thing from no," he said, and then could not entirely believe he had said it, and looked straight ahead at the horizon with his jaw set and his ears warm. She was quiet for a moment. He could see from the corner of his eye that she had turned her head to look at him. He could not see her expression, which was perhaps a mercy. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is." The subject was not discussed further that afternoon, but it was present for the rest of the day like a third rider occupying space, casting no shadow, making itself felt. On the sixth evening, they camped beside the Pawnee Fork itself, where the river ran clear and pleasant through a stand of cottonwood and box elder, and the light died in long gold and rose bars across the western sky. He had been thinking all day about how to say something honest without overstepping, and as they sat by the fire with the coffee between them and the horses quiet at their picket line, he said it. "Alice." He had been calling her Miss Leland for 6 days. The shift was not accidental, and she heard it, because she turned to look at him with full attention. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need you to tell me honestly what you think, because I have no interest in making things more difficult for you." She held her coffee cup with both hands and said nothing, which was her way of telling him to continue. "I don't think you want to marry Coverley," he said. "I don't mean that as a criticism of the man. I've never met him, and he may be entirely decent. But you don't speak about this arrangement the way someone speaks about something they want. You speak about it the way someone speaks about something they're accepting." He paused. "That's different." The fire crackled. A night bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "You're not wrong," she said at last, with a care that suggested the words were being chosen one at a time from a larger available supply. "And I should not have a personal interest in saying this," he went on, because he had decided to be thorough about the honesty. "But I do. I want to be clear about that as well. I have spent 6 days in your company, and I have—" He stopped and looked at the fire and started again. "I have found myself in a situation I did not anticipate when I agreed to escort you to Fort Larned." The silence stretched out between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but very full. "Phineas," she said, and the use of his given name registered somewhere behind his sternum like the snap of a struck flint. "I need you to understand something." She looked at him steadily. "I was not raised to act on impulse. I was raised to be careful and sensible and responsible. And everything that is careful and sensible and responsible in me says that I should continue to Fort Larned and meet Lieutenant Coverley and honor the arrangement my father made." "I understand," he said, "and everything else in me—" She stopped, looked at the fire, looked back at him. "Has been paying a different kind of attention for 6 days. He was very still. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "I genuinely don't. I'm not the kind of woman who throws over a settled arrangement on the strength of a feeling she met on the prairie. But I'm also—" A long pause. "I'm also sitting here on the Pawnee Fork in the middle of Kansas, wanting very badly to not be delivered anywhere." He set down his cup with great care, as though any sudden movement might disturb something fragile in the air. "You don't have to be," he said quietly. "It isn't that simple." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They sat with that for a while. The fire burned lower, and he added another piece of wood without thinking about it. the habitual maintenance of a campfire, and she watched him do it, and the ordinariness of the gesture in the middle of this enormous conversation seemed to contain everything they hadn't yet said. "What would you want, if you could want anything without consequence?" he asked. She thought about it seriously, in the way she thought about everything. "I would want to stay in the West," she said at last. "I would want to teach school. I would want to live somewhere I could ride every morning and grow something in the earth." And she paused again, and then, with a quiet candor that he thought probably cost her something, "I would want to see whether what I think is happening between us is what I think it is." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "I think it's what you think it is," he said. She laughed softly, and the laugh was slightly unsteady, and it was the most honest sound he had heard in 6 days. "That sentence was more complicated than it needed to be," she said. "I'm not a poet," he said. "No," she agreed, and the smile she gave him was the warm, full one, the one that changed her eyes. "But you're honest. I value that more." They did not come to any resolution that night. There was no resolution yet to be had. They were still 6 days from Fort Larned, with an obligation in place and a letter in his saddlebag and a father in St. Louis who had arranged everything to his satisfaction. These were real things, and they both understood that real things required real handling. But something had shifted irreversibly between them, and they both knew it. The 7th day brought a complication of a more immediate kind. They were riding through open grassland in the late morning when Phineas spotted a rider coming toward them from the northeast at a pace that suggested purpose. He watched the rider for a minute, hand on the stock of the rifle in its scabbard beside his saddle, taking his time about reading what the approach meant. The rider was alone, which was a reasonable sign, and slowing down as he got closer, which was another. He turned out to be a young man named Ellis Cobb, maybe 20 or 21, working for one of the larger cattle operations that ranged through that part of Kansas. He was riding to Caldwell with a message and had missed his way in the night and was consequently very pleased to encounter travelers who knew where they were. He also had news. There had been a storm 2 days ago, he said, that had hit the Pawnee Fork hard 20 miles downstream, and the crossing at Jenkins Ford, the crossing Phineas had planned to use on the 9th day, was apparently running dangerously fast. "Old man Jenkins' son rode up toward the Bruns settlement to warn folks," Ellis said. "His father's ford ain't passable for at least another week. Water's still up." Phineas thanked him, gave him directions back to the Caldwell Road, and watched him ride away before he turned to Alice. "We have to reroute," he said. "There's another crossing 15 miles north. It'll add half a day, maybe more." "Does that affect our timing?" she asked. He calculated. "We can still make the fort by the 12th if we push a little harder on days 9 and 10. She nodded, and he noted that she received this information with the same level-headed practicality she'd brought to everything. And he thought, not for the first time in the past 7 days, that she would be an extraordinary person to build a life with, not because she was easy or uncomplicated, because she was neither, but because she brought her full self to everything, and that full self was worth having beside you. The northern route added not half a day but a full day, because what Ellis Cobb had not known was that the secondary crossing was also running higher than usual, though manageably so, and the terrain north of it was rougher and slower going. They made camp that night further from Fort Larned than they'd planned, and the quiet between them as they sat by the fire was weighted with the arithmetic of days and miles, and an approaching end neither of them was rushing toward. "I've been thinking," Alice said on the 8th night, staring into the fire with a directness that meant she had been building to something. "Tell me," he said, "about what I said the other night, about what I would want." She looked up from the fire to his face. "I want to write to my father." He was quiet, letting her continue. "I want to write to him before we reach the fort. I want to explain that I've reconsidered the arrangement and that I believe I need to make my own decision." She paused. "That is going to be a very difficult letter to write and a very difficult letter for him to receive." "Yes," Phineas said honestly. "He is going to be unhappy. He's going to be more than unhappy." She looked back at the fire. He may be very angry, and I love my father and I don't want to cause him pain, but I have been thinking about what you said. About the difference between accepting something and wanting it. He waited. I think, she said carefully, that I have been accepting a great many things in my life that I was not permitted to want. And I think that is something my father did out of love, and I think that is also something that I am done doing. She looked at him again. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, he said. I don't want to deceive Colonel Hartfield, she said, or Lieutenant Coverley for that matter. If I am not going to go through with the arrangement, I want to tell them honestly and properly, not simply fail to appear. That's the right instinct, he said. So I think, she breathed in slowly. I think we should still go to the fort, but not for the reason we set out. He looked at her for a long moment. You could write the letter tonight, he said. We'll find a way to get it sent to your father before we reach the fort. There's a settlement at Cedar Station 2 days out that has a postal agent. She reached into her traveling bag, which she kept with her always, and produced a small journal and a lead pencil. She looked at him with an expression that was determined and slightly terrified in equal measure. I'm going to write it now, she said, before I lose my nerve. I'll get you better light, he said, and built the fire up, and then sat quietly on the other side of it while she wrote to her father, 3 pages in a clear, deliberate hand, and he did not read over her shoulder or ask what she was saying. But the scratch of the pencil on the paper was the most meaningful sound he'd heard in a very long time. The letter to her father was posted at Cedar Station on the 10th day, as planned. The postal agent, a weathered man named Augustus, who looked like he had seen everything the West could produce and been surprised by none of it, promised it would be on the next rider east within the day. Alice stood outside the small cedar plank building that served as Cedar Station's postal office and watched Augustus go back inside, and then she looked at Phineas. Well, she said, that is done. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Terrified, she said, and like I can breathe properly for the first time in 6 months. A pause, both at once, which is a disorienting combination. It's a brave thing, he said. It's a necessary thing, she said, which was her more honest version of the same statement. He wanted very badly to say more than that, to tell her all of the things that had been accumulating in him since the river crossing, all of the specific and genuine reasons he had found over 10 days of trail life, to believe she was the most extraordinary person he had encountered in 28 years of living. But they were still 2 days from the fort, and still in the middle of a situation that hadn't fully resolved, and he kept his own counsel and let the moment be what it was. Cedar Station had a small trading post, and he bought her a replacement pencil because she had worn her original one down almost to nothing on the letter to her father. He handed it to her without comment, and she took it without comment, and they both understood this was more than a pencil. The 11th day was beautiful. The kind of day the Kansas plains occasionally produced in late spring that seemed like an apology for all the difficult days, clear and golden, with a soft breeze and the prairie grasses deep green from the recent rains, the light falling at that particular angle that turned everything warm and specific. Meadowlarks called from fence posts that had no fences attached to them yet. The horses moved well, Chester the mule plodding along with his customary philosophical expression. They rode mostly in silence that day, but it was the silence of people who have said most of the important things and are now living alongside them. He pointed out things as they rode: a red-tailed hawk nesting in a lone cottonwood, a prairie dog town that stretched for half a mile, the distant dark smudge of a buffalo herd moving north along the horizon. There are fewer of them, she said, watching the buffalo. I've read about it. The hunting. More every year, he said. It'll be the end of something important when they're gone. He paused. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, their whole way of living is tied to those herds. When the buffalo go, so does everything that depended on them. It isn't just animals. He looked at the distant smudge, his jaw setting. There's a lot of wrong in this country that gets dressed up as progress. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. There is. They rode on, and he was glad he'd said it and glad she'd agreed, and they didn't need to say more than that to understand that they saw something similar when they looked at the same landscape. That evening, their second-to-last camp before the fort, he asked her the question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the 8th night. "What are you going to do after?" he asked. "After we go to the fort and you speak to Hartfield and Coverley." She had been spreading her bedroll near the fire, and she stopped and straightened and looked at him. "I don't entirely know," she said. "I have some money, not a great deal but some savings of my own, enough to manage for a time." "You said you wanted to teach school," he said. "There are settlements all through this part of Kansas that need teachers badly," she said, and there was something in her voice, the careful restraint of a plan she had been forming in private. "I've thought about it. Cedar Station has 60 families within riding distance and no school. The Bruns settlement is the same. Someone willing to establish a schoolroom could be useful." He nodded slowly. "That's a good plan." She looked at him with those direct eyes. "Is it?" There was something careful and important beneath the question. "The best one I've heard," he said, "and I'd like to tell you something if you'll let me." She sat down on her bedroll and looked at him with full attention, and he sat down across from her and tried to find the right words, which had never been his particular gift but which seemed important enough to try. "When I was sitting on my horse on the bank of the Cimarron on the 3rd day," he said, "looking at that water and looking at you, I had 2 thoughts. One was about the crossing, which I was planning to manage competently, and one was about you and about where I was taking you and about everything I had understood over 3 days of riding beside you, and that thought was considerably harder to manage." She was very still. "I lost my nerve at that river," he said. "Not about the crossing, but about continuing to ride the direction I was riding without saying a word about what was happening to me." He paused. "I've been trying to catch up with my nerve ever since." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was small tonight, just enough for warmth and light, and the prairie sky above them was enormous with stars. "And have you caught it?" she asked quietly. "I'm talking to you, aren't I?" he said. She smiled, the full one, the warm one. "Phineas," she said, "I came out to the West to marry a man I'd never met because my father asked me to, and I have spent 11 days discovering that I am not the same person my father arranged that trip for." She paused. "I don't know what the next step is exactly. I don't know what you're asking me precisely. But I want you to know that whatever you're asking, I am interested in the conversation." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking whether you would consider staying in Kansas," he said. "Not for me specifically, I don't have the right to ask that yet, and I know it. But whether you would consider not going back to St. Louis, whether you would consider teaching school at Cedar Station or the Bruns settlement, whether you would consider giving us, what is between us, the time and the place to become what I think it wants to become." The silence was very complete and very warm. "Yes," she said simply, "I would consider all of those things." He exhaled slowly and nodded, and something that had been wound tight in his chest since the Cimarron crossing unwound itself and settled into something easier. "Good," he said. "Then tomorrow we ride to Fort Larned and you tell Colonel Hartfield the truth, and then we figure out the rest." "Together?" she asked. "Together," he said. They arrived at Fort Larned on the 12th day, just as promised, riding in through the main gate at mid-morning with the sun high and bright, and the fort's limestone buildings solid and pale against the sky. The post was busy soldiers moving between buildings, horses in the corrals, the smell of cookfares and livestock, and the particular organized activity of a working military installation. A young corporal directed them to the headquarters building, where Colonel Hartfield had his office, and they left the horses with the corporal and walked through the fort together. And Phineas noticed that Alice walked the way she had come down Mrs. Calloway's stairs with careful, deliberate grace, like a woman who knows exactly where her feet are and has decided exactly where they're going. Colonel Hartfield was, as Phineas had described him, a serious man. He was in his mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades in weather and command, and had settled into a permanent expression of measured assessment. He received them in his office, looked at the sealed letter Alice presented to him, and then looked at the two of them with that face that was good at reading situations. "Miss Leland," he said after he had read the letter, "I understand there were difficulties with the original Escort arrangement." "There were," Alice said. "Mr. Lawson was good enough to accompany me. We arrived as planned." Indeed, he looked at Phineas. "Lawson, you've done freighting work for the fort before." "Twice," Phineas said. 3 years ago and 2. I remember." Hartfield set the letter down. "You'd like to speak to Lieutenant Coverley, Miss Leland." "If possible," she said, "and to you, Colonel, privately." She glanced at Phineas, who understood immediately, and said he would wait outside, which he did, standing in the courtyard in the spring sunshine with his hat in his hands and Chester the mule tied to a post behind him, watching the activity of the fort and trying to think about something other than what was being said in that office. He was outside for 40 minutes. When Alice came out, she was composed and her chin was up, and she was carrying the sealed letter to Colonel Hartfield, still sealed, because she had not needed to give it to him after all. "How did it go?" he asked. "Honestly," she said, "I told Colonel Hartfield that I had reconsidered the arrangement and that I did not wish to proceed. He was not pleased, but he was decent about it. He's a man who respects directness, I think." She paused. "I spoke to Lieutenant Coverley afterward. She paused again, with the expression of someone choosing words carefully. "He was more relieved than I expected. I think the arrangement was not entirely his wish either. His father and mine and Colonel Hartfield had between them constructed something that neither of the people it most directly concerned had been particularly consulted on." Phineas looked at her steadily. "You're all right." "Yes." She said it with such clean certainty that he believed her completely. "I feel as though I've set something down that was very heavy and that I had been carrying for a long time without fully understanding the weight." He nodded. "Hartfield did ask where I intended to go," she said. "I told him I was planning to establish a school in one of the settlements to the northeast. He said that was admirable and offered a letter of introduction to the Territorial Education Authority, which I thought was rather generous of him under the circumstances." Phineas looked at her with something close to wonder. "You walked out of that office with a letter of introduction." "I walked out of that office with 2, actually," she said. "He also wrote one to a family he knows at a settlement called Anderson's Creek, who had been looking for a teacher and have a suitable building for a schoolroom." She showed him the 2 folded papers with the expression of someone who is very good at making the most of the available situation. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he laughed genuinely, fully, from somewhere deep in his chest. And she laughed too, and they stood in the Fort Larned courtyard in the Kansas spring sun and laughed together, and several soldiers passing by glanced at them with the mild curiosity of people who have seen stranger things on the frontier than 2 travelers finding something hilarious in a fort's central courtyard. They stayed at the fort that night, in the proper guest quarters set aside for travelers, which at Fort Larned meant a plain but clean room for Alice and a bunk in the men's quarters for Phineas. They had supper in the officers' mess as Hartfield's guests. He was formal and courteous, and there was no awkwardness, which Phineas attributed to the colonel's experience in managing difficult human situations with military efficiency. Lieutenant Coverley was polite and distant, and spent most of the meal in conversation with another officer, which confirmed Alice's assessment that the man's relief was genuine. After supper, they walked briefly around the fort's interior perimeter in the cool evening air, the limestone walls pale in the last light, the sounds of the post settling into its nighttime rhythm around them. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and he was walking close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and neither of them moved to create more distance. "What happens now?" she asked. "Tomorrow we ride back northeast," he said. "Anderson's Creek is 3 days from here. We can go there directly if you want to see it." "Do you know it?" "I've passed through. It's a real settlement, about 40 families. They had a school for a while. Teacher left 2 years ago and they never replaced him." She nodded, thinking. "And you She turned her head to look at him. "Where do you go after Anderson's Creek?" He had been thinking about this since the 11th night camp. "I have that quarter section north of Caldwell," he said. "I've been building up the cattle operation." Slowly, he paused. "Anderson's Creek is 14 miles from Caldwell. That's not a great distance." She looked at him with those changing eyes, and the evening light was doing its best work on her, turning her auburn hair the color of old copper and making the hazel of her eyes look almost amber. "No," she said quietly, "it isn't." "I'm not asking you to wait for me," he said, because it needed saying, "or to hold yourself in any particular arrangement. You should go to Anderson's Creek and establish your school and do the thing you want to do. He paused. "I want to know that I'm free to come and call on you. If that's something you'd welcome." She stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead, and turned to face her. "Phineas Lawson," she said. "I crossed the Cimarron River at high water and rode 12 days across the Kansas plains and walked into a military fort and ended a marriage arrangement my father spent 6 months organizing, and I have letters of introduction in my pocket to establish a school in a place I have never been." She tilted her head. "I think I have demonstrated an adequate willingness to do difficult things for things that matter to me." He waited. "You matter to me," she said. "I believe you know that. So yes, you are very much free to come and call on me, and I would welcome it considerably." He reached out then and took her hand, which was the most he was going to ask of this moment, and her fingers closed around his with a warm, definite pressure that said everything that needed saying. "Then that's settled," he said. "Indeed it is," she said. The ride to Anderson's Creek took 3.5 days because they were not rushing now, and the slowness was a luxury they both recognized and quietly savored. The country was beautiful in late May, the grasses deep, and the wildflowers coming in waves of yellow and purple and white, and they rode through it as though they had all the time that existed, which is one of the finest feelings in the world when you are in good company. She told him about her mother's garden in St. Louis, which had been extraordinary roses and kitchen herbs and vegetables in carefully organized rows. She told him about the year she had taught school, and how she had loved the particular morning light in that St. Louis classroom, the way it came in the east windows and fell across the desks, and the students' faces with such simple purpose. She told him she thought education was one of the most important things a person could give or receive, and she said it with the conviction of someone who has believed this privately for a long time, and is now discovering the relief of saying it out loud. He told her about Texas, about the cattle drives he'd done as a younger man, long, brutal months of trail work that had been hard and occasionally magnificent. He told her about why he'd left, which was that Texas had started to feel like a country he was visiting rather than living in, and the Kansas plains had felt different, had felt like somewhere he belonged without needing to justify the feeling. He told her about the quarter section and the small house he'd built on it with his own hands, which was not finished to any particular standard of elegance but was solid and well situated, and had a good kitchen and a porch that faced west so you could see the sunsets. "A west-facing porch is essential," she said gravely. "I thought so," he said. They arrived at Anderson's Creek on the 15th day of their journey, counting from Caldwell, which was 3 days past the original deadline of Fort Larned, and 3 days that neither of them wished to exchange for anything. Anderson's Creek was not a large settlement, a main road with a general store, a post office in a corner of the same building, a blacksmith, a church, and a collection of houses and farms spreading out in every direction. But it had the solid, purposeful look of a place that intended to persist. The people who came out to meet them as they rode in had the same quality, weathered and capable and cautiously welcoming. The family Colonel Hartfield had recommended was named Macpherson James and Ruth Macpherson, who ran the general store and were leaders of the community in the informal way of frontier settlements, where leadership goes to whoever is most reliable rather than whoever claims the title. They read Hartfield's letter of introduction with serious attention, and then looked at Alice with the measuring but not unfriendly eyes of people who need to know whether this stranger is worth trusting. Ruth Macpherson, who was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair and hands that spoke to decades of hard work, asked Alice 3 questions: whether she was healthy, whether she was patient, and whether she could manage arithmetic. Alice said yes to all 3 without hesitation. "We've got a building," Ruth Macpherson said. "It was the school before. It needs work, but the structure's sound. There's a room in back that could serve as quarters for a teacher." "I'd like to see it," Alice said. The building was a single large room with a smaller attached room behind it, built of timber with a stone foundation, on the north end of the main road. The school room needed cleaning, a new stovepipe, and some repairs to the window frames, but it was solid and had good light from the south windows, and the back room was small but habitable. Alice stood in the middle of the main room and looked at the empty space, and the dusty desk still pushed against the walls and the chalk board that had been there since the last teacher and had "Practice your letters" written on it in faded chalk. And the expression on her face was the one she got when something that she had wanted for a long time was suddenly, concretely available. "I'd like very much to take this position," she said to the Macphersons, "if the community would have me." The community, represented in that moment by James and Ruth Macpherson, was delighted to have her. Phineas helped clean the schoolroom that afternoon and fixed the stovepipe the following morning, and James Macpherson brought over lumber for the window frames, and 2 neighboring families sent children over to help carry desks back into position. And by the second day at Anderson's Creek, the school was recognizably a school, and Alice was recognizably its teacher. He had to ride for Caldwell on the morning of the 3rd day. He had been gone more than 2 weeks, and there was the cattle to attend to and the farm, and there was also the practical reality that he needed to return Chester the mule to the man he'd borrowed him from, which was becoming more urgent by the day. He saddled Amos in the early morning, before the settlement was fully awake, and Alice came out of the school building in her riding clothes to see him off, her hair down and loose over her shoulders in the way she wore it in the mornings before she pinned it up. And the sight of her in the morning light with her hair down and her face open and unhurried was something he knew he would carry with him all the 14 miles to Caldwell. "Weeks," she said. "Can you come back in 2 weeks?" "Less," he said. "I'll try for 10 days." She looked up at him where he sat on Amos. "I'm going to miss you," she said simply, and the simplicity of it was the most direct thing she'd said to him yet, which from Alice Leland was saying something. He leaned down from the saddle and took her hand. "10 days," he said. "I'll bring a decent stovepipe flange because that one's going to give you trouble." She laughed and squeezed his hand and let it go. "Ride safe," she said. "Always," he said, and turned Amos north, and rode out of Anderson's Creek with the morning sun at his back and the most profound and uncomplicated sense of purpose he had felt in a very long time. He came back in 9 days. He brought the stovepipe flange and a box of books, a mixed collection he'd assembled from 2 sources, including Mrs. Pruitt's lending library in Caldwell and a box sale at Danner's General Store. He brought a letter that had arrived for Alice at the Caldwell post office, which bore a St. Louis postmark and her father's handwriting on the envelope, and he brought it without comment and gave it to her as soon as she came out to meet him, because it was hers to deal with and he wasn't going to hover. She held the letter for a moment and then said, "Come have coffee first. I'll read it when I'm ready." They had coffee at the small table in her back room, which she had made genuinely pleasant, a cloth on the table, a small jar with wildflowers she'd picked, her books arranged on a shelf she'd asked the Macpherson son to build. He told her about what had been happening in Caldwell, which was that a new family had arrived from Ohio and set up a bakery, which was broadly considered to be an improvement. She told him that she had 11 students already registered and was expecting 4 more by the end of the week, and that Ruth Macpherson had donated a globe for the classroom, and that the Macphersons' youngest daughter, a girl of 9 named Clara, was the sharpest student she had encountered since her year of teaching in St. Louis. Then she read the letter. He watched her face carefully as she read it. She had let him stay while she read it, which told him something. Her expression moved through several changes, a tightening around the eyes, a softening, something that might have been the near approach of tears that was controlled and redirected. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table with both hands flat on the paper, and she looked at him. "He's angry," she said, "but he says he loves me and he doesn't want to lose me. He says he doesn't understand." She paused. "He asks if there is someone." A longer pause. "I think he already suspects there is from the way I worded the letter I sent from Cedar Station." "What are you going to say?" Phineas asked. "The truth," she said without hesitation. "The complete truth. I should have given him more of it in the first letter." She straightened in her chair. "He deserves to know I am well and safe and where I am and what I am doing. And he deserves to know," she looked at Phineas across the small table with its jar of wildflowers. "He deserves to know about you." He was very still. If this is," she paused, choosing her words. "I would like to tell my father about you, Phineas, if you are willing to be told about." She paused again, with the very slight air of someone who is about to be unusually vulnerable and has decided to do it anyway. "To be the reason." He reached across the table and put his hand over both of hers where they rested on her father's letter. "Tell him," he said. She looked at his hand on hers for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and the hazel of her eyes was very warm and very clear. "I will," she said. He came back every 10 days after that, through June and into July, and the visits lengthened from a day to 2 days to 3. And the road between Caldwell and Anderson's Creek became familiar to Amos in the way that horses know their regular routes and begin to make them without being guided. He was not the only one making the trip. Alice came to Caldwell twice, once for a supply run and once to return Mrs. Pruitt's books and discover that Mrs. Pruitt had approximately 40 more she was willing to lend to a frontier schoolteacher. And each time she came she stayed at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, which was entirely proper, and they ate supper at the town's one restaurant and talked for hours about everything. Her father's second letter came in late June. It was shorter than the first but more specific. He wanted to know Phineas Lawson's circumstances, his character, his intentions. Phineas sat down at Alice's table in her back room and wrote to her father himself, on borrowed paper in his own direct handwriting, and said everything honestly. His circumstances were modest but real. His character he would leave to others to assess. His intentions were as serious as any intentions he had ever held about anything, and he hoped Mr. Leland would consider the matter with the openness it deserved. Her father's third letter arrived in August. It was long, and Alice read it at the table with Phineas beside her this time rather than across from her, and she read it aloud, which told him she was not afraid for him to hear it. Her father wrote that he did not understand this country or why anyone chose to live in it. He wrote that he had worried about Alice since her mother died. He wrote that he had wanted to secure her future because security was the only thing he knew how to give. And then, in the particular way of determined men who love someone enough to accommodate what they cannot control, he wrote that he had received a letter from a Phineas Lawson that he had read several times, and that he found the man to be direct and clear and not unreasonable, and that if Alice had chosen this for herself then he would not continue to oppose it. And then he asked if he might come and visit, in the fall, if travel permitted, to see this Kansas country for himself and to meet this Phineas Lawson in person. Alice set the letter down and looked at Phineas with eyes that were definitely bright now, not quite tearful but very close to it. "He wants to come," she said. "I read that part," Phineas said, and put his arm around her, which was the most he had done yet in terms of physical proximity, and she leaned into it immediately and completely with the same decisive quality she brought to everything. "Is that all right?" she asked. "If he comes?" "He's your father," Phineas said. "Of course it's all right." She looked up at him from the shelter of his arm. "He's going to ask you about your plans," she said. "He's going to ask about your intentions, specifically and concretely." "I know," he said. "What will you tell him?" He looked down at her, with her head resting against his shoulder and the August light coming through the schoolroom's south windows and the chalk board behind her with the day's lesson still written on it. He thought about the river crossing and the fire on the sixth night and every conversation in between and since. He thought about west-facing porches and stovepipe flanges and letters written by firelight. "I'll tell him that I intend to ask his daughter to marry me," he said. "And that I'm asking him first because that seems right. And I'll tell him that I'm hoping she'll say yes, though I have some confidence on that front." She was very still against his side. "Some confidence," she said. "Reasonable confidence," he amended. She laughed, and it was the full, warm, unguarded laugh, and she turned her face up to look at him properly. "Phineas, Alice, ask me now," she said. "Don't make me wait until my father arrives." He looked at her for a moment, and then he shifted and turned properly toward her and took both her hands in his, and the August afternoon held very still around them. "Alice Leland," he said, "I was hired to escort you to a fort and hand you off to another man, and I lost every nerve I had at the first river crossing when I understood that I could not do it. I have spent 4 months being grateful for that failure of nerve. I would like to continue being grateful. I would like to marry you if you'll have me, and live on the quarter section north of Caldwell with the west-facing porch, and ride to Anderson's Creek every week, or have you in Caldwell, or find whatever arrangement means you have the school you want and I have you close enough to find. I love you. That's the plain center of all of this." The August light moved through the schoolroom and settled on her face, and she looked at him with those clear, changing, extraordinary eyes. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, without reservation." He leaned forward and kissed her, because that was the right thing to do next, and she kissed him back with a directness and a warmth that felt, like everything she did, entirely and specifically like herself. Robert Leland arrived in Anderson's Creek in September, on the stage from Caldwell, which he had reached by the Union Pacific from St. Louis. He was a well-built man of 55 with gray at his temples and Alice's direct eyes in a sterner face, and he stepped off the stage and looked at the Kansas plains with the expression of a man who has come somewhere entirely foreign and is trying to approach it with good faith. Phineas met him at the stage stop alongside Alice, and the two men shook hands, and Alice's father looked at Phineas for a long moment with an assessment that was frank and thorough. "You're the man who was supposed to deliver my daughter to Fort Larned," he said. "I am," Phineas said, "and you failed in that responsibility." "Deliberately in the end," Phineas said, "though I honored the obligation in every technical sense. She arrived at the fort. She spoke to Colonel Hartfield herself and made her own decision. I was there when she did." Robert Leland looked at his daughter. "He's not wrong," Alice said. "I made every decision myself." Phineas supported them. A long moment. Then Alice's father said, "Well, show me this country." Phineas spent 3 days with Robert Leland that September. He showed him the quarter section north of Caldwell, the small house with its west-facing porch, the cattle, the land that was neither grand nor humble but solid and real. He showed him the schoolroom at Anderson's Creek, where Alice stood in front of 15 children with a piece of chalk and a globe, and did the thing she had always wanted to do with a clarity and a joy that was visible from the doorway. He answered every question the man asked, which were precise and numerous, and he answered them all with the same directness he'd put in the letter. On the last evening, they sat on the porch of the house north of Caldwell and watched the sun set over the plains in one of those spectacular Kansas autumn sunsets that seem to make up for every difficulty the country has put you through, long bars of amber and crimson and deep rose, the sky enormous and personal at the same time. Alice was inside, having somehow ended up in the kitchen, from which the smell of something excellent had been emerging for the past hour. "She looks well," her father said. He said it quietly, as a man says a thing he is relieved to find true. "She is well," Phineas said. "She's doing what she's meant for." Robert Leland was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset. "I thought I knew what she needed," he said. "I thought I was right." "You wanted to protect her," Phineas said. "That's not nothing." No, he turned to look at Phineas. But it isn't enough either, a long pause. She's her mother's daughter. Her mother always knew her own mind better than I gave her credit for. His voice was measured and slightly rough. I should have learned that lesson the first time. Phineas said nothing, which seemed like the right choice. Take care of her, Robert Leland said. Not as a command, as a man asking for something real from someone he has decided he can ask it of. She takes care of herself admirably, Phineas said, but I'll be beside her while she does. The older man looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once with the finality of a decision made. Good enough, he said. They were married in November in the Andersons Creek Church, on a cold, clear day with the plains frost-white, and the sky that particular deep blue of Kansas autumn, and every family in the settlement present. Along with Ruth and James, Macpherson and Mrs. Calloway from Caldwell, who had made the 14-mile trip to attend. Sheriff Prout came as well, which Phineas thought was appropriate, since the man had set the whole thing in motion from behind a cup of coffee at Danner's General Store. Robert Leland was there, having made the return journey from St. Louis for the occasion. He walked his daughter down the short aisle of the Andersons Creek Church with an expression that was complicated and tender, and he shook Phineas's hand at the front of that church with both of his, which was more than Phineas had expected, and which meant something he did not try to put into words. Alice wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding weeks with help from Ruth Macpherson, a deep burgundy wool, practical and beautiful at once, which was everything she was. She came down that aisle with her head up and her eyes on his face, and the direct, steady composure of a woman who is doing exactly what she has chosen to do, and Phineas thought he had never seen anything as fine in his life. The ceremony was performed by the Andersons Creek minister, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Cole, who managed to be both brief and thorough. And when he arrived at the relevant portion and asked Alice Leland if she would take this man, she said yes with her clear voice and those changing eyes on Phineas's face, and the word filled the small church and the frost-bright day outside it with equal clarity. They lived, that first winter, partly at the school. She kept her rooms there through the school week, unwilling to abandon her students to the long, cold days without their teacher, and partly at the house north of Caldwell, where Phineas had been making improvements since September with the focused energy of a man who knows what he's building toward. The house grew that winter. A second bedroom, a proper study with a bookshelf that ran floor to ceiling on one wall, a kitchen addition that was worth making given what Alice could do with a kitchen. She taught school 5 days a week and rode to Caldwell on Friday evenings. 14 miles on the sorrel mare she had eventually purchased from the Caldwell livery, who had been renting the horse to travelers for years, and was genuinely moved when the mare was bought by someone who would treat her with the respect she deserved. The mare was named Pepper by Alice's students, and the name stuck. The spring of 1875 came in warm and early, and with it came the news that the Andersons Creek School was being recognized by the Territorial Education Authority, partly on the strength of Colonel Hartfield's letter of introduction, which Alice had submitted with her application, and which had carried the weight that letters from military colonels tended to carry. The recognition came with a small stipend, which was not large but was real, and with it the possibility of expansion. Alice wanted to build a proper schoolhouse larger, with better windows and a separate room for older students. Phineas drew up the plans and organized the building, and by August the Andersons Creek Schoolhouse was a structure that a person could point to with genuine pride, and 23 students filled it on the first day of the new school year. Robert Leland came back in that summer for a visit that lasted 2 weeks. He slept in the guest bedroom of the Caldwell house and spent considerable time on the west-facing porch watching the sunsets, and by the end of the 2 weeks, he had stopped looking at the landscape with the wariness of a foreigner and had begun looking at it with something closer to understanding. He and Alice sat up late talking one night while Phineas was in the barn checking on a cow that had been off her feed, and when he came back, he found the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, their voices low and earnest, and he left them to it because there are conversations between parents and children that are no one else's business and are necessary and long overdue, and this was clearly one of them. The cow recovered, which Phineas had expected. Whatever was said at the kitchen table seemed also to resolve itself into something healthier, because Alice and her father parted on the last morning of his visit with a long, genuine embrace, and Robert Leland shook Phineas's hand again with both of his and said, with the difficulty of a proud man finding his way to a feeling he isn't used to articulating, "Thank you for making her happy." "She does that herself," Phineas said. "I just have the good fortune to be present for it." Her father looked at him with something that took a moment to identify as approval, real approval, the kind that had to be earned rather than given. In the fall of 1875, Alice told Phineas she was expecting a child over breakfast on a Tuesday morning, with the same direct composure she brought to everything, watching his face for his reaction. His reaction was a silence that lasted about 3 seconds and then a feeling that expanded in his chest like the first warmth of a fire catching, enormous and simple and entirely good. "When?" he asked. "April, I think." He got up from the table and came around to her side of it and crouched down beside her chair, which brought him level with her face, and he took her hands and looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling extremely well," she said. Slightly tired in the mornings, but well. She looked at him with those warm hazel eyes. "You look stunned." "I am somewhat stunned," he said honestly. She laughed. "You knew this was a possibility when you married me, Phineas." "Yes," he said, but knowing, and he shook his head slightly, still holding her hands. "This is real. This is happening." "It is," she agreed. He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly to his forehead because it was the only physical language that was adequate to the moment. She put her free hand on the back of his neck, warm and steady, and they stayed like that for a long minute in the morning light of the Caldwell kitchen, while the planes outside the window went about their ancient, indifferent business. She wrote to her father that week, and his response arrived within 10 days, which meant he must have written back the same afternoon he received the letter. It was warm and full of feeling and slightly disorganized in a way that told her he had written it quickly, without his usual deliberateness. He asked if she needed anything. He asked if she was eating properly. He said he intended to visit again in the spring. "He says he intends to visit in the spring," Alice said, reading the letter aloud at the supper table. "That means he intends to be here when the baby comes." "Is that all right?" Phineas asked. She looked up from the letter. "More than all right," she said, and the softness in her voice when she said it settled something between them that had been in the process of settling all year. She taught school through February, which was her compromise with practicality. She would stop when she needed to and not a moment before. Ruth MacPherson organized a rotation of mothers from the settlement to keep the schoolroom running through the final weeks, which Alice accepted with more grace than she might have a year earlier, having learned the art of accepting help from people who offered it in genuine community spirit. Their son was born on a Wednesday morning in late March of 1876, just ahead of the April estimate, attended by the Andersons Creek midwife, Mrs. Holt, who was very competent and deeply unimpressed by first-time fathers standing in doorways. Phineas had been dispatched to the kitchen and had spent the preceding hours doing something productive with his hands, repairing a chair that had not actually needed repairing for weeks, but had been kept in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. When Mrs. Holt opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he walked through it and saw Alice in the bed, tired and radiant in the particular post-birth way that combines complete exhaustion with a kind of luminous accomplishment, and in her arms a small, furious, perfect person wrapped in the blanket Ruth MacPherson had made. Alice looked up at him, and her face did the thing, the full warm smile, the one that changed her eyes. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small and very certain about his opinions regarding the world. And he thought about everything that had brought him to this room, a cup of coffee at Danner's general store and a sealed letter and a woman who came down a boarding house staircase and shook his hand. A river running high in the spring. A fire on the Kansas plains. The particular courage it takes to want something out loud. He has your eyes, Alice said. He has your expression, Phineas said. He looks like he already has opinions and is compiling evidence. She laughed tiredly. He's going to be difficult, she said. He's going to be extraordinary, Phineas said. They named him James Robert Lawson James for the Macpherson, who had been the first person in Anderson's Creek to offer them real community, and Robert for Alice's father, who arrived from St. Louis 3 days later, and held his grandson with the careful reverence of a man who has understood something important about the difference between what he planned and what was given to him. Robert Leland held that child in the kitchen of the Caldwell house and looked out the window at the Kansas plains, and then he looked at his daughter and his son-in-law and said, with the simplicity of a man who has traveled a long way in more than physical terms, "He's beautiful. You're both well. That's everything." Alice stood beside Phineas with her shoulder against his arm and looked at her father holding her son, and Phineas felt her breathe out slowly, all the way down, the complete exhalation of something at rest. The years that followed were full and good and real in all the ways that matter. Alice taught school at Anderson's Creek for 6 years before the school grew large enough to need a second teacher, at which point she moved into the role of school director, organizing the curriculum and hiring the teachers who came after, and the Anderson's Creek School became known throughout the territory as one of the best-run frontier schools in Kansas. She never stopped teaching entirely. She kept the older students, the ones preparing for whatever came next, and she put into them everything she had ever understood about the world and what it required and what it could offer. She and Phineas had 3 children in the end. James Robert came first in 1876 and grew up to be, as predicted, opinionated and excellent. A daughter followed 2 years later, Margaret Clare, who arrived with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes, and from approximately her 2nd birthday, an absolute certainty about everything, which served her well throughout her life. And a second son, William Henry, in 1882, who was the quietest of the 3 and the most observant, and who took after his mother in the particular way he could look at any situation and simply understand it. Phineas built the quarter section into something substantial over those years. Not a grand ranch, but a solid, working operation, with good cattle and the land well managed. And the farmhouse expanded over time in increments that told the story of a family growing into its space. He did less freighting work as the years passed, and more of the local work that tied a man to a community. He served 2 terms on the county board, helped organize the water rights negotiations that kept the small operations from being swallowed by the large ones, and was generally considered to be someone whose judgment on practical matters was worth seeking. He and Alice had, between them, built exactly the life they had each sketched out on the 11th night of their journey, sitting by a small fire on the Kansas plains, though neither of them had known at the time that they were doing it together. The west-facing porch was, as it turned out, everything it needed to be. They sat on it every evening the weather permitted, through spring and summer and fall and into the mild early winters, and watched the sun go down over the plains in all its extravagant variation. Their children did their schoolwork on the porch in good weather, and guests were entertained there, and important conversations were had there. And occasionally, when the children were in bed and the day was over and the sky was doing its most extraordinary work, Phineas and Alice simply sat together in the 2 chairs she had painted a particular deep blue and watched the sunset without speaking, because they had long since achieved the kind of closeness in which silence is not an absence but a fullness. Sheriff Prout retired in 1879 and came to supper to celebrate, and they raised a glass to the conversation at Danner's general store that had, without any of them knowing it at the time, set everything in motion. "I should have charged you a finder's fee," the sheriff said, contentedly eating Alice's cooking. "You paid me $20, Phineas said. "Best $20 I ever spent," Prout said happily. Alice poured the sheriff more coffee, and exchanged a look with Phineas over the sheriff's head. That was the look of two people who have been living alongside each other long enough to have a complete conversation in a glance. The look said, "All of this from $20 and a river crossing." The glance back said, "And a woman who would not be delivered." The thing that Phineas had understood standing on the bank of the Cimarron, that he could not cross that river and continue in the direction he'd been pointed, had turned out to be the truest thing he'd ever understood about himself. The nerve he had thought he was losing had not been the courage to cross the water. It had been the courage to acknowledge what mattered. And acknowledging it, out loud and at the cost of the original plan and the $20 and every expectation he'd been handed, had given him everything he was sitting in the midst of. The house with the west-facing porch, the three children with their opinions and their various excellent qualities, the woman across the table from him who still looked at him with those clear, changing, hazel eyes, and still had the full, warm laugh that caught him off guard whenever it arrived. He had been supposed to escort her to the fort and marry her off to a man she'd never met, and he had lost his nerve at the first river crossing. It was, without question, the best thing he had ever failed to do. On their 20th anniversary, in November of 1894, Phineas and Alice Lawson sat on the deep blue chairs of the west-facing porch as they had sat on hundreds of evenings before, with the last of the autumn sunset burning down across the Kansas plains in long bars of amber. James was 18 and arguing politics at the supper table with growing eloquence. Margaret was 16 and had already informed her parents that she intended to study at a proper university, a plan both of them supported with complete conviction. William was 12 and currently somewhere in the near pasture, examining something interesting that he would report on at length later. The plains stretched out to the west in all their enormous indifference, beautiful and real, unchanged in their essential nature from the way they had looked on the day Phineas and Alice had first ridden through them together. The grass moved in the autumn wind in its ancient, slow wave pattern. The last hawk of the evening was making a final circuit before settling for the night. 20 years, Alice said. 20 years, he agreed. She turned to look at him, and the fading light caught her face the way it had caught it on the very first campfire, turning the auburn of her hair, silver-threaded now, autumn to the spring it had been, into something warm and particular. The hazel of her eyes was exactly what it had always been. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she asked, "if you'd simply kept riding past the Cimarron and delivered me to Fort Larned as instructed?" He considered this seriously. "Coverley would have had a very capable and unhappy wife," he said, "and I would have come back to Caldwell $20 richer and missing something I didn't know I was missing yet." He paused, which would have been unbearable in retrospect. "It would have been," she agreed. "Fortunately," he said, "I lost my nerve." She laughed, the full, warm, unguarded laugh, the one that had always been unaffected by time, and reached over and took his hand, and he held it in both of his the way he'd held it in the Andersons' Creek schoolroom when she'd said obviously yes without reservation. And the sun finished its slow descent beyond the plains and left behind it that particular deep blue that was the last light of a day well lived. William came in from the pasture shortly after, carrying something he'd found and needed to explain, and the evening gathered itself around them all, the lamplit kitchen, the voices of the children, the smell of supper, the solid walls of the house that Phineas had built with his own hands and kept building, year by year, to contain the life that had grown within it. Outside, the Kansas night settled over the plains in its wide, ancient silence, broken only by the wind in the grass and the occasional cry of something alive and free in the darkness. And the west-facing porch stood empty in the starlight, patient and faithful, waiting for tomorrow evening when they would sit on it again and watch the sun go down, and not need to say anything at all because everything had long since been said.